In terms of African American military manpower, again, the major recruitment of African American men begins in early 1863, and by the end of the war, will result in the recruitment and placing into the field of some 186,000 volunteers. Had the Civil War continued into the summer of 1865, the boys of 62, the white volunteers of 1862, their enlistments would have expired. And so at that point, African American military manpower, which by 1865 comprised 10% of the Union Army, would have been of very great importance to the continued Union war effort. Now, the poster on the left is obviously a poster that was intended to recruit African American soldiers, and you can see the slogan there: "Who would be free themselves must strike the blow." And this gets at a major, probably the central motivation for African American troops, that they were taught that they were fighting for often the freedom for themselves and their loved ones if they came from the American South, or in the North. The idea really was that you were dealing with free African Americans, to be sure, but African Americans were very much second class citizens. And very often in history, military service has been a way by which marginalized groups have attempted to move toward first class citizenship and first class participation in political life. Sometimes this strategy works, oftentimes it doesn't, but this was the hope of, of African American troops when they enlisted, and this was the hope of those who played a major role in the enlistment of African American soldiers, such as the Black abolitionist Frederick Douglass. You can look down and you can see that a couple of things. First, that these soldiers are going to be paid a bounty of $200 to enlist, so that by this period of the war, the idea of offering bounties had become sort of normalized and applied to African American troops as well as white troops. That having been said, there was never a draft for African American troops. Every African American who enlisted in the Army did so voluntarily, and this is in a contradistinction to being military labor, some of which was voluntary and some of which was coerced. If you look down at the bottom, you'll see that the pay for African American troops is $10 a month. And for much of the war, this $10, the pay that African American troops received was less than that white soldiers received. White soldiers received a payment of $13 a month. African Americans, obviously, $3 a month less. In addition, the cost of uniforms and so forth came out of the pay of African American troops. So African American soldiers continued to be continued to be to be prejudiced against, even though they enlisted in the Army. Also, while a good many African American troops did participate in combat, there was a tendency to use them in the rear areas, particularly for garrison duty, rather than in battle. The Union General William T. Sherman, in fact, refused to use any African American troops in the field at all. He was very strongly of the opinion that African American troops were not the equal of whites and were not to be trusted on a battle line. So prejudice still was a factor that African American troops had to deal with throughout the war. If you look at the photograph on the right, you'll notice, obviously a body of African American soldiers, but on the left is the officer in command of them. And while there were African American sergeants and sergeant majors and non-commissioned officers of various kinds, African American troops were always officered by white men. And frequently, these white officers came from the ranks of Union regiments. So they had been enlisted, they had been non-commissioned officers, sergeants in these white regiments. And one of the things that sort of was used to attract them to be officers in African American regiments was the prospect of being officers, whereas in white regiments they would have remained um, non-commissioned officers only.